We don't propose, like some people, to meet today's problems by saying they don't exist, or tomorrow's problems by wishing that tomorrow wouldn't come. Men make history, and not the other way around. In periods where there is no leadership, society stands still, but progress occurs when courageous, skillful leaders seize the opportunity to change things for the better. We're in opportunities like that, aren't we? So, here's the basic story, okay? You see here in the upper left-hand corner, the red, federally controlled land. Lower left-hand corner, that's wildfires more than 250 acres. Isn't that crazy how similar that is? Upper right-hand corner, that's roadless, rural, and wilderness areas. Access completely shut off. Bottom right-hand corner, $150 trillion in mineral value locked up in federally controlled lands. 150 trillion with a T. Those maps tell the whole story. They tell the whole story. We have environmental destruction, economic depression, access to our lands shut off because we're breaking the basic recipe. So here's just some of the basics, right? This was in the Washington Post a while ago. Wildfires are scorching the earth and burning through the United States bank account. And some people call that environmentalism, right? Burning 5 million acres a year, wildlife in the millions burned alive, destroying the watershed, polluting the air, and there are some people out there that call that environmentalism. I call that an opportunity. I call that an opportunity to get back to how we tend the garden, and you have a healthy garden is a productive garden. And a productive garden is a healthy garden. But if you just leave it there to burn, that's what we're facing right now. But shame on us for allowing people to call that environmentalism and get away with it. So you've seen charts like this before. From the left to the right, top to bottom, that's billions of board feet harvested, millions of acres burned. Right? This is not hard stuff. Record-setting wildfires every year. You know that. You've seen that. I mean, the Douglas Complex fire, we see this every year. The pollutants that come off of this, I was just in Arizona presenting recently. They said that the federal government, in the wildfires, the mismanagement of the forest, is the single largest polluter in the state of Arizona by hundreds and thousands of times over. And shame on us for allowing people to call that environmentalism. It's one of the greatest environmental catastrophes of our age. So here you've got, this is right here in Oregon. This is wood products employment going from 78 to 2008. You've gone from nearly 82,000 jobs in the wood products industry to about 30,000 jobs in 30 years. Communities are dying all over the West as these policies that are taking away local control of the land. This is what people don't talk about. I mean, wildlife, protected species in the millions, being burned in wildfires because they're not managing and tending the garden, tending the forest. These are issues we need to own. Now, the solutions that are being ignored, this was just 2 weeks ago. UC Merced scientists discovered, concluded in their study that if they simply thinned the forest to the sustainable forest level, 50 to 100 trees to an acre, if they just did that in the Sierra Nevadas, it would preserve 1 million acre-feet of water. That's 326 billion gallons of water that would be preserved. At the same time, in harvesting the forest at sustainable levels, you would fund education. You would fund health and human services. You would fund public safety, where women, like in Josephine County, don't get raped because the sheriff can't respond, because they've gone from 30 sheriff's deputies down to 2, and they can't respond to calls like that anymore. Right? More than 250 billion gallons of water would be preserved if we just managed the garden. A healthy forest, a healthy garden is a productive garden. Productive garden is a healthy garden. Federal government, when they can't manage their own finances, what do? They shut down the national parks overnight. For Utah, that's an $8 billion industry. I'm sure in Oregon, same thing. Overnight, they just shut down the lands. And yet there are people out there that will say, you can't manage your own land. Would Oregonians shut down Oregon's national parks ever? Of course not. Of course not. Would you allow your forest to just burn and wildlife to be destroyed and watershed and habitat be destroyed for generations? Of course not. But when you have 527 members of Congress not from Oregon managing your land, These are the kinds of results that you get. When you have bureaucrats that are unelected, unaccountable, not from Oregon, generally on a 2-year rotation from New Jersey, these are the kinds of results that you get, and they call that environmentalism. I call it an opportunity. Energy independence locked up in federally controlled lands. 3 years ago, the Government Accountability Office, testifying to Congress, said there is more recoverable oil in Utah, Colorado, Wyoming, locked up in federally controlled lands than the rest of the world combined. Our energy independence is in the hand of foreign powers that simply don't like us, that don't believe in the same principles of liberty and property and self-governance that we do, and yet we have more recoverable oil than the rest of the world combined locked up in federally controlled lands. Also on 60 Minutes, the end of March, Leslie Stahl did a piece on 60 Minutes. The title of the piece was, "Our National Security is in the Grips of China." We can't put a plane in the air, we can't put a ship on the water. Electronics technology, renewable energy technology does not function without rare earth minerals. Right now, 90% of the rare earth minerals for all of that technology in the world come from China. And yet we have them locked up all over in federally controlled lands. Our national security is at risk because of the basic policies of liberty, property, and self-governance being violated. It matters. It matters for our states. It matters for our nation. It matters for our communities. In fact, on Tuesday, I'll be going to a county commission meeting in Utah where Garfield County is going to be holding a meeting to declare an economic state of emergency. Because that's where President Clinton made the Escalante National Monument and locked up 2 million acres, $2 trillion worth of the world's cleanest burning coal, and the community, the county is now a ghost county. This is serious. This is happening all over the West. So Ronald Reagan said, this is a wonderful time to be alive. He said, we're lucky not to live in pale and timid times. We've been blessed with the opportunity to stand for something. And like Benjamin Franklin with a Facebook page, or like Thomas Jefferson with a Twitter account, we have the opportunity to reach out in ways that have never been seen in the history of the world before. What an opportunity. Now let's go through some of the basics that we're talking about. On the website, you'll see the policy statement that was passed unanimously by leaders around the nation working on the transfer of public lands. The things that we're talking about, federal public lands become state public lands. We understand after hundreds of years, we've become a public land people. There's so much dependency built up and rights and valid existing rights in those that we need to have those managed and sorted through at the local level. Federal public lands become state public lands to protect multiple use, sustain yield with local planning. It's on the website. You'll see all sorts of people will go different directions and they'll try to say all of the different scare tactics of what this is about. This is about federal public lands becoming state public lands for more effective local control of our lands by those whose lives and livelihoods depend on the wise stewardship of our land. We're talking about multiple use lands, not national parks. We're talking about multiple use lands, not congressionally designated wilderness areas. We're talking about multiple use lands, not national monuments, in Utah with the exception of that Grand Staircase monument that's created ghost counties. So let's start at the beginning, okay? Vince Lombardi, every year Vince Lombardi would start out the same way. With the world champion professional Green Bay Packers, he would start out every season the same way. He would assemble his professional world champion football players, and he would hold up a ball, and he would say, gentlemen, this is a football. And he would talk about how long it is, and how the dimensions of it, and how much it weighs, and then he would walk them out to the field, and he would say, gentlemen, this is a football field, and this is how wide it is, and this is how long it is. And he would say, gentlemen, these are goalposts. And he would talk about how tall they are and how wide they are. And then he would go through even more basics from there. And they would start with a stance and with blocking. With world champion Green Bay Packers, they start with the very basics. I think it's important that we always remember the fundamentals and start with those basics. In the Declaration, we were given the creed for why we became a new nation. So that we were endowed by our Creator with unalienable rights of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, which meant property and the ability to govern ourselves. Right and control of property and self-governance. And that to secure these rights, governments exist among men. governments plural. To secure these rights, government exists among men, deriving their just powers from consent of the governed. Who's the boss? We are. If you want to be treated like the boss, you have to act like the boss. If you don't act like the boss, you won't be treated like the boss. It really is that simple. These are the basics. These are the basics. Deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. Do you consent to 5 million acres of forest a year being burned? Do you consent to wildlife in the millions every year being burned? Do you consent to the air being polluted hundreds and thousands of times more than any power plant? Do you consent to the watershed being destroyed and being wasted? Do you consent to your productive resource in sustainable productivity being burned instead of used to fund education and public safety? No, well, if you want to act like the boss, if you want to be treated like the boss, excuse me, you've got to act like the boss. That's what we're going to talk about, okay? So, George Sutherland was our one and only United States Supreme Court Justice from Utah. He made this statement. He says, man has 3 rights. 3 great rights. They're so connected together as to be a single right. Life, liberty, and property. Implied in that is the ability to govern ourselves. If you give a man his life but take away his liberty, you take away all that makes life worth living. If you give him his liberty but take away the property, which is the fruit and the badge of his liberty, you still leave him a slave. Property is the essence of our liberty, which is the purpose of our life. We're accountable for what we do with those things. But that's the very essence. Property is essential to our foundation. It's not just something nice. It's not just something, wow, I'd really like to control my own property. Property is the essence and the foundation of our system of government. But if we want to be treated like the boss, we have to act like the boss. Think about these people that came to Oregon. Why would they come here? I mean, the hardships, the wagon trains. I stood in Baker, Oregon and saw the trail, the 50,000 wagon trains that came here. Yeah, I'm sure it was, like a walk in the park to get here, wouldn't you think? Right? I mean, nice, beautiful day like this. I'm sure they had nice weather and good shoes, and it was just easy to come here and come to this beautiful place. No, why did they come here? They risked everything to come here for a place to call their own and to govern themselves and to secure opportunity for future generations. They risked everything, and it cost us nothing because of what they were willing to do. What are we willing to do? So Ronald Reagan said, government's first duty is to protect the people, not run their lives. That's government's job. But remember, governments exist to secure those rights, and they derive their powers from the consent of the governed. So, basics, okay? We have a system of government that has checks and balances, right? Now, you've probably seen something like this in 8th grade civics class, right? Checks and balances, executive, legislative, judicial, and then you'll get the gold star in your 8th grade civics class and say, I know the checks and balances of government. That's not our government. That's a single republic. James Madison said, in a single republic, checks and balances are between the 3 branches of government. In the compound Republic of America, power is first divided among 2 distinct governments, and they control each other as a double security to the rights of the people. That's our system. But that's not the end of the story, because Madison also said in Federalist 45 that the balance in that, where the power is divided among 2 governments, that the power delegated is limited and few, and the powers reserved to the states are numerous and indefinite. That's what our government looks like. Have you ever seen a diagram at all like that describing our government? You've seen the triangle, right? The checks and balances. But that's what our government looks like. But see, rights we don't know are no better than rights we don't have. Rights we don't exercise are no better than rights we don't have. If we don't understand our system, how can we drive it? So, when we don't understand our system, it feels a lot more like this, doesn't it? You get Jabba the Fed that just gobbles up everything. That's where we are, because we don't understand our system. But if we're going to be treated like the boss, we've got to act like the boss. We've got to know what our system is. So, this comes from the Supreme Court 3 years ago. The United States Supreme Court 3 years ago, Justice Roberts voiced the opinion for the court and said, these are the basic principles. This isn't calculus government. This isn't government 404. This isn't even government 101. This is remedial government. These are the basic principles, he said in the opinion. Look at what he says on the basic principles of our government. The powers which concern the lives, liberties, and properties of the people are held by governments more local and more accountable than a distant federal bureaucracy. These are the basic principles. This is the football, right? The Supreme Court said the independent power of the states serves as a check on the arbitrary power of the federal government. These are the basic principles. They said that by denying any one government complete jurisdiction over all the concerns of public life, federalism, this idea that power is separated, protects the liberty of the individuals from arbitrary power. And he said, we look to the states to defend their prerogatives by adopting the simple expedient of not yielding to federal blandishments when they don't want to embrace federal policies as their own. This is the federal government 3 years ago saying, teaching us the basic principles of government. Have you heard this in a civics class ever? Have you heard this in legislative training ever? Have you heard this in training as county commissioners ever? Supreme Court 3 years ago said these are the basic principles. They also said that states are separate and independent sovereigns. Sometimes they have to act like it. Separate, independent sovereigns, sometimes they have to act like it. These are the basic principles. So think about a bicycle, right? We have a system where power is divided among two distinct governments. And if you've got one bloated wheel and another wheel that's entirely flat, I'm sure if you just pedal faster, it'll work out really well, right? No, you have to balance the system. We have fundamentally a system problem. And yet we keep trying to cook up new policies or find a new personality. We have a system problem. But if we want to be treated like the boss of our system, we have to act like the boss. And rights we don't know are no better than rights we don't have. So I've got, a lot of this is recapped in a little book that I've got out there on the tables, and you can get that, but more information. But we have to know this because the people that we hire to represent us, we have to make sure that they understand what they're doing. Instead of playing government, they have to understand the system. Okay? So rights we don't know are no better than rights we don't have. Rights we don't exercise are no better than rights we don't have. So let's get into some of the basics here. The Supreme Court 2 years ago, United States Supreme Court 2 years ago said the constitutional equality of the states is essential to the harmonious operation of the republic. Think about what that says. If the states aren't equal, our system doesn't work. We'll talk a little bit more about that as we go. The constitutional equality of the states is essential to the harmonious operation of the republic. By the way, they brought about a 150-year line of cases dealing with statehood, dealing with the transfer of public lands current to 2013. That was a material part of their holding. This wasn't just dicta. This wasn't just a sideline in their statement. They also said that our nation is a union of states. Our nation was and is a union of states, equal in dignity, power, and authority. So think about this for a second. Equal in, does this look equal? No. In liberty, in power, in authority, in dignity, in any way? Remembering that liberty, property, self-governance are the basic fundamentals that our system is built upon? So think about this for a second. Any of you see the NFC Championship game last year? Earlier this year, rather? Right? You had the Seattle Seahawks and the Green Bay Packers, and halfway through the game, Richard Sherman sticks his arm out, and he just gets his arm blasted between a couple of players. Right? You remember the game? And the rest of the game, he's just grimacing, he's just wincing, you could just see the pain on his face, right? But he doesn't come out of the game. If you're Aaron Rodgers, what do you do? I don't care. I mean, he's such a great player. Even great player that he is, but you got a guy with one arm, and he's just doubled over. I mean, you go after him, right? Now, what if you have, instead of just Richard Sherman, you have your whole defensive backfield has maybe one or two of their arms beaten up. And maybe a couple of your linebackers have one or two arms and maybe two arms and a leg out of commission. What do? Take advantage of that all day long, right? Government's the same way. Government is the same way. Our system was developed to have healthy tension, requiring a constitutional equality of the states. But when Commissioner Bridenthal over here, Commissioner Linthicum and others that were in state government, when you don't have the ability to govern your own land and you're not equal in dignity, power, and authority with respect to your own land and your liberty and your self-governance, the federal government in 1976 said, I know we were supposed to transfer the land. For 200 years, we understood that it was a trust duty and we were supposed to transfer this land so that you did have liberty and property and self-governance. We're just going to keep the land in federal control. That was a bill in 1976 called the Federal Land Policy Management Act. But they said not to worry because we're going to give you payment in lieu of the taxes that you would otherwise charge or be able to generate if you governed yourself. Payment in lieu of taxes, and we shortcut that and call it PILT, and I think we do ourselves a disservice in doing that. Payment in lieu of the taxes we would generate if you honored the same promise you kept with Ohio. If you honored the same promise you kept with Nebraska and Iowa and Louisiana and North and South Dakota, payment in lieu of taxes. Now, it's only ever been about 13 cents on the dollar of the value that we could generate. That's a great deal, right? You'd like 13 instead of $1, right? Great deal. Now, even though it's only been 13 cents on the dollar, you know how well the federal government manages its financial affairs, right? This is supposed to be just as good as sovereignty, and yet the federal government hasn't had a budget since iPads have been around. They haven't had an actual budget for more than 7 years now. And so the PILT, here's what happened just last year. So western counties got halfway through their budget year, dependent upon these PILT, these payment in lieu of taxes, dependent on them for education and public safety and health and human services. Halfway through their budget year, it still hadn't been funded, and the federal government came and said, you want your PILT payments, I understand. You want this money that they're calling Western welfare now in the East. Well, in order to fund this PILT payment, we're not going to put it in the continuing resolution, but in the Farm Bill, we'll put in the PILT payments so long as you agree to an additional $200 billion, $50 billion a year or $40 billion a year over 5 years. As long as you agree to an additional $200 billion in food stamps, we'll give you the $400 million in PILT. Do you see why the constitutional equality of the states is essential? If you're vulnerable, you'll be exploited politically. That's just the nature of politics. And so the representatives throughout the West, anytime the federal government needs to grow, anytime the federal government needs to expand and grow the finances, it's got the ability to exploit the western states because we don't have equality and liberty and property and self-governance. Unfortunately, that's just the nature of the way government works. Now you see here, this is the percentage of SRS payments lost, what was called secure rural schools. How secure is that? That was supposed to replace the revenue that you generated from the most world-class forests that there are, that you use to fund the best funded schools in the nation, the best funded public safety in the nation here in Oregon, that are now boarded up, and ghost towns, and you have sheriffs sending out notices saying, we can't protect you because they can't fund basic public service. So the secure rural schools was supposed to replace that revenue. It's now entirely gone, and your communities are dying. Communities in Utah are dying, throughout the West are dying. Same thing with projected federal land payments. They're off millions of dollars per county. So the fundamental basic premise of this, I mean, this is how simple it is. The promises at statehood for the federal government to transfer the public lands are the same. You might ask the question, why did the federal government ever own so much land in our state anyway? It goes back to the Revolutionary War. In the middle of the Revolutionary War, they were broke, and 7 states had claim to western lands and 6 didn't. And because they were statesmen, they said, let's take these claims to western land, we'll put them in trust. And we'll give title to our partnership, because the Constitution didn't exist yet. We'll clear title here so that the lands can be disposed. We're going to facilitate disposal of the land. We're going to clean up all the claims. We're going to give a quit claim and facilitate disposal of the land to pay the debt, create equal states where the states can then, in the states and the counties, generate revenue and govern themselves. All states from Indiana to the West did the very same thing. All states cleared title to the federal government in trust to facilitate disposal of the land. When they got to the Rocky Mountains, they just simply stopped. Promises are the same. In fact, your promises in Oregon, I think they're better than the ones in Utah because yours tie right to Illinois and Ohio and Missouri, and they're exactly the same. In fact, I'll show you some of that, right? So promises are the same, it's already been done, and this is the only solution big enough. We'll go through those 3 points. This is going to be hard to see, but you can see this on the website. If you go to the website and you go under the resources and you see what's happening in my state and you click on Oregon, you'll see your enabling act side by side, your statehood agreement side by side with Illinois and with Iowa and others. They're word for word the same. Here you've got Missouri and Oregon. Here you've got Iowa and Oregon. In fact, now just to your north, you've got Washington State and Montana. They not only have the same language in their statehood agreement, they have the exact same document that created North and South Dakota that also created Montana and Washington. The exact same document created 4 states. In 2 they disposed of the land, in 2 they didn't. They have the exact same language on the federal government's duty to transfer title to the public land. And yet you have people saying, well, your land is arid, so therefore the federal government keeps it. I mean, I've had law professors tell me this, right? We were in a continuing legal education panel, and they say, no, the land is arid, so therefore the federal government keeps it. Dennis, you're familiar with the arid clause of the Constitution, right? It's in the law professor edition, apparently. Right? I mean, they actually make these arguments. And then they say, well, you just gave up your land. That's statehood. You know those people that came in the wagon trains that risked everything to get liberty, property, and self-governance? The argument is that their very first act of statehood was to just give up all the land. Does it make any sense? But these are the arguments that they put out to say, this is impossible. In fact, some of you may have seen 2 weeks ago, a big dark money DC group came out and said, it's so impossible that to even talk about this amounts to fraud. And so they've sent letters to AGs in Arizona, Utah, and Montana to investigate me for fraud. Because this is so impossible that to even talk about it is fraudulent, they say. They're concerned about, we're having success. We're winning because we're starting to act like the boss. We're starting to get back to that basic formula of liberty and property and self-governance, right? Okay, so this is going back historically, where you had 7 states had claim to the western land. They all transferred their claims so that the federal government could transfer the land for the most amount of money and as fast as possible, so the states then had the liberty and the property and the self-governance to manage their own lands. The governor of Wyoming, that statehood, the governor of Wyoming said, the state of Wyoming will, after the date of its admission, receive 5% of the receipts from all sales of U.S. lands within its borders, which will continue until all such lands are sold. They said, this is a great deal. We cut this deal with the federal government that we agreed to give them clean title, because as they dispose of the land, we get 5% of the proceeds of the sale to educate our kids. This is a great deal. Because they understood the same thing that Nebraska understood, that Louisiana understood, because they had the exact same statehood term. In Utah, when they delayed disposing of the land, within less than 20 years of them delaying the disposal, the state legislature in Utah said, in conformity with the terms of our Enabling Act, we demand that you dispose of these lands. By the 1930s, they had already pushed Congress to pass legislation to transfer the public lands to the states. Then they ran into the Great Depression and World War II, and after a 20-year hiatus, you had folks in the federal government saying, well, this is just the way it is. And shame on us that we sat back and said, well, I guess that's the way it is, right? That normalcy bias. So some people have said, well, this is just clearly not legal. Well, the Supreme Court has said repeatedly that these enabling acts are solemn compacts. They're two-way promises to be performed in a timely fashion, and that the federal government only holds territorial lands in trust for the states ultimately to be created. Now, so Dennis, in the Constitution, we do have Article 4, Section 3, Clause 2, that, remember, few and defined powers to the federal government. This is Article 4, where that's the provision for the rights of and obligations to the states. Now, the powers of Congress are over there in Article 1, right? Article 2 is the powers of the President. Article 3, the powers of the courts. And then Article 4 is the rights of and obligations to the states. In the section of the Constitution for the rights of and obligations to the states, it says, Congress shall have the power to keep the lands forever and ever and ever and ever and ever if it feels like it. It doesn't say that, does it? It says Congress shall have the power to dispose of the lands and make needful rules and regulations respecting the territory and not prejudice any claims that the states have or that the United States has. They understood this trust arrangement that they had established to pay the national debt, and to create states equal in dignity, power, and authority. They had created that same deal all across the states from Indiana to the West. So you'll find on the website legal analyses from the Federalist Society, 40,000 constitutional lawyers, scholars, professors, from BYU Law Review article, 85 pages, about 250 footnotes. And yet this dark money DC attack organization said, oh, there's no legal basis at all because they conveniently ignore all of this stuff. Right? I mean, when the facts aren't on your side, you attack people and marginalize, and that just tells us we're winning. That simply tells us we're winning. We're over the target and deeply under somebody's skin in what we're doing. 2009, the United States Supreme Court unanimously said that Congress does not have the authority to change the uniquely sovereign character of a state's admission, particularly where all of its public lands are at stake. Think about that. Congress doesn't have the authority to just change the deal in the middle of the game, which is what they did with FLIPMA. The United States Supreme Court, in 2009, Congress does not have the authority to do that. So just last Tuesday, just this week, Utah, we've appropriated $2 million. We've just hired a special legal team to begin moving forward the case. Now, on our special legal team is arguably the top constitutional scholar in the United States. He actually wrote the book, the 7-volume book, The Treatise on the Principles of the Constitution, is on the legal team for the state of Utah, moving this forward. So here's what I find really fascinating. For decades, these were the western states. From Michigan to Iowa to Louisiana and to that great western state of Florida. Right? 90% federally controlled for decades. For decades. Now, if we had time, I'd show you Illinois' arguments, Florida's arguments. Florida used to send resolutions to Congress. We're the worst off of all the western states, they said, because you're not disposing of our lands. We can't educate our kids. We can't grow our economy because you're not disposing of the land like you promised. They banded together. It was one man that stood up. One leader that stood up. One leader that, again, if we want to be the boss, we've got to act like the boss. We've got to hire and inspire leaders that understand these principles. One man. His name was Thomas Hart Benton. He was a Democratic senator from Missouri. And he said, my election to the Senate of the United States found me doing battle for changing this system of disposing of the public lands. He said, I resolved to move against that whole system. He said, I did it in a bill, but more so it was out to speeches to the public, the bosses, and talking to them and helping them understand the rights so that they mobilized and moved their leaders. He said the federal government was like a stepmother instead of a natural mother. They became a monopolizer of the vacant lands of the West. Illinois and Florida and Louisiana and Alabama, right? They became a monopolizer of the vacant lands of the West, and like all monopolies, it resulted in a hardship. He says, but the members of Congress, and I would submit that county commissioners and state representatives and leaders should fix their eyes steadily on the period of the speedy extinction of the federal title to all the lands within their boundaries. And they did. And they did. This has already been done before. Iowa has 0.3% federally controlled land. They were 90% federally controlled for decades. Illinois has 1% federally controlled lands. They were 96.25% federally controlled for decades. Rights we don't know are no better than rights we don't have. Rights we don't exercise are no better than rights we don't have. Hawaii in 1959. Hawaii mobilized politically and at statehood refused to tolerate the federal government controlling all of their lands. And in their Enabling Act, it says, the United States hereby grants to the state of Hawaii title to all the public lands within the boundaries of the state. Because they simply mobilized politically and demanded. They refused to take no for an answer. Now, some out there will say, well, states can't afford to manage their own land. Have you heard that? States can't afford to manage their own land. Now, first of all, just think about that for a second. Only in the hands of the federal government is property and natural resource a liability. Everywhere else, property, resource, the ultimate assets. But this is the party that we're talking about that says the states can't afford to manage their own land. $18 trillion in debt, increasing by $1 trillion a year, not to mention a $5 trillion a year increase in the unfunded obligations. But the report that Jeff talked about, this Property Environmental Research Center report, it just came out a couple of months ago. They said, by all accounts, federal lands are in trouble, both in terms of fiscal performance and environmental stewardship. And get this, so the federal government, for every dollar it spends managing public lands, loses 27 cents. It's a great deal, right? You make it up in volume. That's the way federal accounting works, apparently. For every dollar the states spend managing public lands, and states manage millions of acres of public land, the states generate on average $14.51 for every dollar spent. Which would you prefer? I mean, I'm not an economics major or anything, but lose 27 cents for every dollar, generate $14.51 for every dollar, and have healthier forests, healthier lands, fund education, fund public safety, have vibrant communities and healthier lands. The Forest Service is so busy meeting procedural requirements that it has trouble fulfilling its historic mission to sustain health, diversity, and productivity of the nation's forests and grasslands to meet the needs of present and future generations. We have good Forest Service workers, in many cases on the ground. Their hands are tied. In their own Forest Service report, you can look this up, they call it the process predicament. They call it analysis paralysis because of the management by litigation. The management of the forest has completely been shut down. Therefore, we have millions of acres burning. Wildlife in the millions being burned. Watersheds, habitats destroyed for generations. We can continue to consent to this, or we act like the boss. This is just the graphs of the difference, right? So Ronald Reagan said the 9 most terrifying words, right? I'm from the government, I'm here to help you out. We would respectfully request of our federal partner that they focus on those things that only the federal government can and should be doing, like world peace and a sound monetary system. You know, once they get that right, we can talk about other things. Get that right first, right? Let's help our federal partner focus on those things it should be doing. But we don't need it to help us out in managing our forests and educating our children and protecting our people. Some have said the states will sell off all the land. Well, it's those at the federal government that are proposing bills to just sell off all the public land because they don't understand that for 150 years in Oregon, you've been a public land state and you've got all these cross-pollinated rights and expectations that you have to address and deal with on the ground. You've got grazing rights and mining rights and access rights that are there that we need to deal with. And so many at the federal side, they just look at that as something to sell off. Now, worse yet, you've got China is now compelling South American countries to auction off land and resources to satisfy debt obligations to China. Now, aren't we grateful that we don't owe any money to China, that could become a problem for us, right? No, this is already happening. This is already happening. And so, federally controlled lands, wildfires more than 250 acres, we've looked at some of this. In the present crisis, government is not the solution to the problem. Unfortunately, government is the problem. The environmental devastation is tremendous. Some have said this is impossible. We've already talked about it. It's already been done before. Ronald Reagan said there are no easy answers, but there are simple ones. Just keep the same promise. Just keep the same statehood promise with the states to the west of the Rocky Mountains that you kept with the states east of the Rocky Mountains. There are no easy answers, but there are simple ones. In Canada, this has already happened. Canada, over the last decade, has, they call it devolution. They have transferred land, water, and resources from the Canadian federal government to the provinces and territories. They've already done it. Now, it wasn't, some people think it's like flipping a light switch, it's either yours or it's ours. No, they had a transition period where they did away with 27 different federal statutes. They enacted local statutes to deal with and manage the land. They took the same funding that they were already using, they transferred that as a block grant to transition the funding out. This is already happening. Canada is outpacing the United States on liberty and property and self-governance. But if we want to be treated like the boss, we have to act like the boss, right? States all over the West and states to the East. You've got bills pending in your legislature right now. Congratulations to you. There are many of you that have been engaged very actively in that. How wonderful that you're having these debates. How wonderful that you're having these debates. Every Western state except California introduced transfer of public lands legislation this year. We just simply haven't had time to get to California. 4 states in the East, Georgia, Tennessee, Arkansas, and South Carolina, passed resolutions supporting the transfer of public lands to the West. South Carolina State Representative Alan Clemens said, "We in the East are tired of paying billions of dollars for the federal government to mismanage Western lands." Legislation all over the West, legislation pending in so many different states. In Congress, Congressman Bishop, who chairs the Natural Resources Committee, formed the Federal Land Action Group. Because, as they say, the federal government has been a lousy landlord for Western states, and we simply think the states can do it better. If we want healthier forests, better access to public lands, more consistent funding for public education, more reliable energy development, it makes sense to have local control. Congressman Chris Stewart, who's chairing the Federal Land Action Group, to begin developing legislation to move forward on the transfer of public lands. And yet we've got the jackals in Washington that want to preserve federal control at all costs and say it's fraud to even talk about this. It's already happening. Because of the things that you're doing and the education that we're moving forward, we're succeeding to an extent that has some deathly afraid of losing that federal control. Resolutions all over the National Association of Counties, the American Farm Bureau, Republican National Committee, the National Association of Counties, school districts, farm bureaus, water districts, on and on and on have done resolutions supporting the transfer of public lands. You can find those on the website. Republican National Committee. Not just a GOP thing. We've got chambers of commerce, school districts, cities all over the West that have done resolutions supporting the transfer of public lands. Those are some of the things that you may want to think about doing as activities to go forward. Ronald Reagan said our people look for a cause to believe in. A banner of no pale pastels but bold colors that make it unmistakable where we stand. So what can we do? What can we do? Number one, there's a petition on the website. Petition says, I want better access, I want better health, I want better productivity for our public lands. Sign the petition, send it out, encourage other people to do the same thing. Second thing, remember that Benjamin Franklin with a Facebook page? Tell someone, share with someone. Share with them this information. This information is spreading across the United States. It's being discussed all over because of groups just like this. They're taking this basic information and sharing it on Facebook and Twitter and emails and handing it over the fence post. We've got to get people educated because rights we don't know are no better than rights we don't have. The next thing you can do is tell your leaders. I'll tell you a quick story. I was in D.C. last week, and when I went to meet with Representative Ms. McMorris Rogers from Eastern Washington, as I walked into her office, she stuck out her hand and said, "You're a rock star in my district." The reason she said that is because she's been hearing from her constituents and from county commissioners and from state representatives and from her staff over and over and over and over again, "Representative, we want the federal government to honor the same promise to our state so that we can manage our own lands, so that we can fund education and have better access and health for our lands." That's exactly what we need to do. To your local, state, and national leaders, we need to be persistent that they become Thomas Hart Benton, that was the one who compelled the transfer of lands when those great western states of Illinois and Missouri and Arkansas already succeeded in doing this. The last thing you can do is open doors. There are so many people with means and resources and the ability and the desire to change the trajectory of our nation, and they simply are looking for the answer, the solution big enough to make this happen. Open doors to those people. Help them understand this is a solution big enough. There are states all over the West, all over the nation, organizations moving, but there are people with tremendous resources that are out to continue to preserve and maintain that tight-fisted federal control. Open doors to those. Now your leaders, what can they do? Education. We've got to get this information out through the hearings and the things that you're doing. Negotiation. Every time we have access to federal officials, we need to put them on the spot and say, why aren't you honoring the exact same promise to Oregon that you kept with Iowa? Why aren't you honoring the same promise with Oregon that you kept with Illinois? Why should we not establish local control and constitutional equality of the states? Legislation. You're moving legislation in Oregon. You need to build your ranks and build your networks to continue to move that legislation forward here. And then litigation. As I mentioned, in Utah, we've appropriated $2 million. We've hired the top legal team, and you're going to start seeing more and more as that moves forward. So in this handbook, if you go onto the website, we'll send this to you. We'll send you some other materials that'll give you some one-page talking points and other things. but this will just walk through some of the things that are in there, what happens after the transfer, the legal analyses, the story about how the western states have already done this, some of the economic analysis, some of the things that we can do and the support that's out there. I want to just share with you a story. I was with Mike Lee last week, Senator Mike Lee, and we were talking about this, and he says, you know, this is just like The Lion King. You remember The Lion King, the Disney movie? When Scar was in control, the Pride Lands completely died. And Scar had his jackals and his hyenas that maintained that tight-fisted control over everything, and the lands died. I mean, they just withered, right? But Simba comes back into control and allows people to just live their lives and control themselves. And you know, they had this song, the whole Circle of Life song. And if you remember the great point in that movie when Mufasa, Simba's father, right? He comes to him. So before Simba comes back, he's all wondering, God, this situation's so terrible. I can't do this. I can't do this. I can't go back. I can't do this. And his father appears to him and he says, look inside yourself. You are more than what you've become. You're more than what you've become. Remember who you are. Remember why those people came in those 50,000 wagon trains to come to Oregon. Something we've paid nothing for, but we've received the benefit. Remember who we are. Ronald Reagan put it this way. 1987, we've already talked about it. He said, this is a wonderful time to be alive. We're lucky not to live in pale and timid times. We've been blessed with the opportunity to stand for something, for liberty and freedom and fairness and property and self-governance. These are things we're fighting for, worth devoting our lives to. So let us go forth with good cheer and stout hearts, happy warriors, not to seize back a country and a world of freedom. Thank you very much.
Questions?
So, if you have questions for Ken, please feel free. We've got some time for that.
Yes, sir.
If China sees our federal lands as collateral, is it the federal government's property to sell?
Great question. If China looks at our land as collateral, is it the federal government's property to sell? Rights we don't know are no better than rights we don't have. And if we tolerate the federal government exercising control over our land, they'll do what they will. That's why it's absolutely imperative that we assert those rights and the duty that the federal government has to honor the very same promise to Western states. Because a desperate debtor does desperate deeds.
Right.
And our nation is the most desperately indebted nation in the history of the world. And so it's critical, if we want to retain control of our lands. I'm sure China is not likely to be the greatest environmental steward of our forests and our lands. I'm sure that the opportunities for liberty and property and self-governance will not be the same if those lands are ever relinquished in control. And so it's critical that we assert these rights. And so, no. One of the things that we can do with our members of Congress is make sure that they tee that question up squarely. Whenever they have members of the federal agencies in front of them, to specify very clearly, is there anything that we've done that have directly, indirectly, express or implied, encumbered these lands in any way to debtors, to creditors of the United States? I think it's important to get that on the record. It's critical to get that on the record. I don't know of anything where there is an express obligation that we've encumbered any of our lands, but that's something we absolutely want to have on the record, and it's something we very much want to put at the forefront, because as your 18 trillion in debt increasing by $1 trillion a year, we've already got China, the IMF, the BRICS talking about removing the dollar, unseating the dollar as the international reserve standard, because they know that we're running out of runway. We can't just keep printing money to satisfy overspending. These are critical issues. So no, it's very important that we tee those questions up.
But under the ONC agreement, it's not federal land.
Yeah, you've got your ONC situation, your Oregon, California land situation. You've got an even more fascinating argument, because those were already private lands and then they took them back, right?
Yeah.
So no, very fascinating. But those are all part of the arguments that we put into the legal mix. Yes, ma'am.
Haven't we already lost some land through the free trade zones? I've been seeing free trade zones like at the airports in Oklahoma City. There's these huge blocks of free trade zones, and I'm understanding it's to China for a sovereign area.
He said, haven't we already lost lands to free trade zones? And there's some questions that aren't some of them controlled by China. There's a variety of different things, and whether those lands are federal public lands or land in other areas, I can't speak to that. But it's a critical issue, right? It's a critical issue that if we don't assert that right, we lose the right. And we may not lose the right legally, but we lose it because it's just been practically lost for so long. So it's critical that we move forward and continue to assert, and we need to expect that there's going to be vehement opposition. There are those in control, those who have control, those who have indebted our nation that are so ingrained in that they may fight vehemently to protect that stranglehold, just like the Scar and the Simba, right? You had Scar and the hyenas fought like crazy until they ruined the whole Pride lands. We're in a situation much like that. And it's critical that we step forward if we're going to secure the same opportunity going forward that those who came here did for us. Yes, ma'am.
I was going to say, in a time when we find a lot of discouragement with the way the Constitution is ignored, when I talk about this issue to young people, it is the one thing that I see them really get excited about because it gives them opportunity for their future. Otherwise, they just see debt, 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 debt. I'll never get anywhere and I won't have any opportunity. But this issue fires young people up.
Thank you very much. She talks about how this is a message of hope. This is a message of opportunity. We have an opportunity to secure things going forward for future generations. If I were 18 right now, I don't know what I would think. I mean, 18 trillion in debt, the unfunded obligations, we're shutting down access to resource and lands. It is very daunting. And yet there is a solution big enough. There's no reason to be burning 5 million acres of our forest, polluting the air and destroying the watershed, killing animals. There's no reason for that, except that we've tolerated it. I mean, that makes me just absolutely furious that that's happening. The lands are being destroyed when, again, productive lands are healthy lands, and healthy lands are productive lands. We have that opportunity to fund education in communities. There's no reason that woman in Josephine County should be raped because the sheriff only has 2 deputies and can't respond. There was an NPR story just a couple of years ago. There's no reason for that when that resource is sitting right there and it's just simply being allowed to burn. There's no reason when we've got more resource than the rest of the world combined that we should be dependent on nations that hate us and that pursue principles very different from liberty and property and self-governance. There's no reason that our military should be dependent on China when we have rare earth elements locked up all over the West. So this is a message of hope. This is a message of opportunity that we simply need to carry forward. And I would challenge you. Go find 1 or 2 other people. Tell them this information. Share this information with them. You can find videos of the presentation. You find this handbook on the website that walks through in basic form what we've talked about. Share with 2, and if you can share with 2, share with 10. I know you've been sharing with hundreds. The opportunities we have to spread that message is unlike any other time in the history of the world. Yes, ma'am.
How do you, maybe you can tell us how Canada addressed the preference? Anybody I talk to, they talk about preference to natural resources.
How did Canada address the preference issue? When you say preference, what are you referring to?
People who use the natural resource land.
So they simply transferred that to local control, and so they allowed people locally on the land to carry over those rights and balance those rights. I mean, there is a balance that needs to happen, right? You have to balance environmental care with access, with productivity. Well, who better to balance that for Oregon than Oregonians? Who better to balance that for Utah than Utahns? And in Canada, they already, in fact, I love this. This is what they discovered. They said, we discovered, right? We discovered that when people closest to the land, water, and resources make the decisions, we get a better decision. Right? Right. Imagine that. Imagine that Oregonians managed the health, safety, welfare of their community. In fact, there's studies out of Congress that I have it for Washington and Idaho and Montana. I don't have it for Oregon, but I know it would be similar. That the state of Washington is only 1,283 times more effective at generating revenue per forested acre than the U.S. Forest Service. Montana is only 917 times more effective at generating revenue per acre than the U.S. Forest Service. Right?
It's not about resource, it's about control.
It's about control. It's exactly right. Yes, ma'am.
Could you touch on what's happening with water rights?
What's happening with water rights? Well, when water rights is a critical issue. It's an absolutely critical issue. If you go back into, there's a pamphlet, it's available on our website. Gifford Pinchot is the father of the U.S. Forest Service, and he put out a pamphlet to basically sell the concept of the Forest Service to the American people. It's called Use of the National Forest, and in that, there were a bunch of questions that they would pose and answer, and they said, what about water? And they said, oh, well, the Forest Service is going to be great for water because it's going to create this wonderful sponge that's going to hold and preserve the water. But of course, we all know that water is a local matter, and the jurisdiction over water is only held by the state, right? But rights we don't know, or rights we don't exercise, are no better than rights we don't have. It's critical that our leaders at the local level begin to understand that jurisdiction over water is a local matter. Because again, if we continue to allow those rights to go downstream, with land comes water, comes everything else. So it's absolutely critical that we understand that jurisdiction and stand on those jurisdictional areas. It's a huge area. It's a huge area. As we lose control of water, that controls, particularly in all of the western states, that controls everything about the access and use of our lands. Yes, sir.
When I talk, I have a lot of mining friends, and when I talk to these folks, probably our biggest protection, we're under attack here in Oregon, California, and Washington's coming. We're left to the federal mining law of 1872. If that was gone, probably you would see placer mining, at the very least, gone from the state of Oregon and California. So what do you say to these people about local control when locally they're under attack? It's terrible.
Yeah. So the 1872 mining law and what would happen to mining rights in a transfer scenario. Nationally, leaders working on this the issue have established unanimously that all valid existing rights would carry over status quo. Grazing, mining, access, recreation, hunting, fishing, you carry those over status quo. Now that's going to take some sorting through and working out. But yeah, you'll have to, as they did in Canada, they did away with the federal laws, but they established state laws and local laws in their place to deal with them. Now some have said, I don't know if I trust my state, right? I don't know if I trust my state more than the feds. Well, I can tell you, you're going to have incompetence in government at almost every level. But where you've got more local control, you've got more direct accountability and direct access. It's much easier for you to mobilize on Salem than it is on Washington, D.C. It's much easier for you to mobilize at your county commission than it is at Washington, D.C. Right now, your land policy is being governed by 527 members of Congress, not from Oregon, by a federal bureaucracy that is not elected, not accountable, generally not from Oregon, and they're rotated through on a 2 to 3 year basis that before they ever come up to barely have access and understanding of the land, then they're rotated out. That's what's happening now. And so that local control, self-governance is not easy. It never has been, it never will be. But if we won't manage ourselves, someone else will be happy to take control of us. It's time for us to step up and take control and do that.
And speaking of time, all right, so I know that some of you have additional questions. You will have an opportunity to ask them during the panel discussion that Ken will be a part of, along with some other distinguished guests, and will be moderated by Mark Anderson from iSpy Radio. And that's going to happen around 2:30, okay? So don't worry, you'll have plenty of opportunity to have your questions answered. Great questions, great answers on the part of Ken. Would you give him a great round of applause? Thank you, Ken. All right, so in a moment, we're going to break for lunch for